I did it because she was my sister. For 28 years, Margaret was the person I called when the world didn't make sense. She was the one who drove 4 hours through a snowstorm to sit with me the night my wife passed. She was the one who taught my son how to tie his skates when I couldn't bend down anymore because of my hip. When they told me Margaret drowned in Lake Simcoe, when they said her canoe flipped in a sudden squall and her body was never recovered, I made a decision standing right there on the dock where they pulled up her empty life jacket. I would take care of her family. I would make sure her husband, Thomas, and their little girl, Sophie, never struggled. My name is Arthur Beaulieu. I'm 64 years old. I live in a narrow brick house in Oshawa, Ontario. The same house my parents bought in 1971 when my father got his job at the GM plant. Margaret and I grew up in this house. We carved our initials into the maple tree in the backyard when I was 9 and she was 7. Those initials are still there, swollen with age, barely readable, but I can trace them with my fingers and remember exactly the afternoon we did it. She used my Swiss Army knife and nicked her thumb. I gave her my popsicle to make her stop crying. After the drowning, after the memorial service where we had nothing to bury, I started sending Thomas $2,000 every month. My pension from the auto plant covered my mortgage and groceries, but that was about it. So I picked up shifts driving a delivery truck for a flooring company in Whitby, 3 days a week, hauling rolls of hardwood and laminate up and down staircases in new builds. My hips screamed. My lower back seized up some mornings so bad I had to roll out of bed sideways and stand in a hot shower for 20 minutes before I could straighten up. But every time I drove over to Thomas's townhouse in Ajax and handed him that envelope, every time I saw Sophie's finger paintings taped to the front window, I felt like I was keeping a piece of Margaret alive. Thomas lived in a tidy little place on a cul-de-sac near the community center. 3 bedrooms, small yard, a fence that needed paint. I'd show up on the first Saturday of every month around 10 in the morning. He'd open the door, take the envelope, shake my hand, always grateful, always tired looking. He'd tell me Sophie was doing well in school, that she'd joined a skating club, that she asked about Uncle Arthur all the time, but there was something behind his eyes I could never quite place. A flicker, like a man checking his watch when he thinks you aren't looking. Something restless. 3 years. 3 years of that drive from Oshawa to Ajax. 3 years of hauling flooring with a body that begged me to stop. 3 years of eating dinner alone at the kitchen table, looking at the chair where my wife used to sit on one side, and remembering the chair where Margaret used to sit on the other when she'd come over for Sunday roasts. Then, on a gray Wednesday afternoon in October, my neighbor Gerry knocked on my back door. Gerry was 76, a retired letter carrier who'd walked routes in Oshawa for 31 years. He knew every street, every house, every face. After he retired, he kept walking. 3 kilometers every morning, rain or shine, snow or sleet. Said it kept his blood moving. We'd been neighbors for 22 years. He was at my wife's funeral. I was at his hip replacement recovery. Good man. Quiet. Didn't waste words. Arthur, he said, standing on my back step with his hands buried in his jacket pockets. Can I come in? I need to talk to you about something. I put the kettle on. We sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of red rose, the same brand my mother used to buy. Gerry stirred his tea but didn't drink. He looked like a man trying to figure out how to deliver bad news without breaking something. What's going on, Gerry? He set down his spoon. You still sending money to Thomas every month? Every month. 2,000. And you always go on the first Saturday? Morning time? That's right. Around 10. He knows I'm coming. Gerry nodded slowly. He wrapped both hands around his mug like he was cold, even though the kitchen was warm. Arthur, I need you to do something for me. Pick a different day. A weekday. Don't tell Thomas. Drive over there, park somewhere down the street, and just watch the house for a couple of hours. My stomach went tight. Why? He shook his head. I can't say. Not yet. I might be wrong, but I don't think I am. And if I'm right, you need to see it for yourself. Please. I'd known Gerry long enough to trust his instincts. The man had spent 3 decades reading people's faces through screen doors and mail slots. If something had caught his attention, It was real. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, I drove to Ajax. I parked on a side street 2 blocks from Thomas's townhouse and walked to a Tim Hortons on the corner that had a window facing his cul-de-sac. Ordered a double-double I didn't want, sat in the corner booth and waited. At 11:15, a woman walked up to Thomas's front door. She was maybe 40, dark hair pulled back, wearing a gray peacoat and carrying a reusable grocery bag. She didn't knock. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a key, and let herself in. A key. My fingers tightened around my coffee cup. 40 minutes later, the front door opened again. Thomas came out first, carrying a cardboard box. The woman followed with 2 more bags. They loaded everything into a silver SUV parked in the driveway, a vehicle I'd never seen before. But what made the air leave my lungs was what happened as they walked back toward the house. The woman brushed her hair behind her left ear. Then she laughed at something Thomas said, and she tilted her head to the right, just slightly, the way a person does when they're teasing someone they love. And when she laughed, her shoulders shook in a specific way, a quick tremor, like she was trying to hold the laughter inside, but it escaped anyway. I knew that laugh. I'd heard it 10,000 times, at birthday parties and Christmas dinners, in the back seat of our parents' station wagon on road trips to Wasaga Beach, on the phone at midnight when one of us couldn't sleep. My sister had a habit she'd carried since childhood. Whenever something genuinely amused her, she'd tuck her hair behind her left ear first, then tilt her head right. Then her shoulders would shake exactly twice before the sound came out. It was involuntary, specific, unmistakable. Margaret was alive. I sat in that Tim Hortons until my coffee turned cold and the lunch crowd started filling up the tables around me. I sat there until my hands stopped shaking, which took a long time. Then I drove home in silence. No radio. No thoughts I could organize into sentences. Just a roaring white noise in my head. I pulled into my driveway and walked straight to Gerry's house. He opened the door before I knocked. "How long have you known?" I asked. Gerry led me to his living room, sat me down, poured me a rye and ginger without asking. 8 months, he said. Maybe 9. My daughter lives in Pickering, right? I was walking her neighborhood one morning, early, around 7. Saw a woman getting out of a car in front of a house on Liverpool Road. She was carrying a bag of bagels from that place on Kingston Road that Margaret always liked. And she did that thing. The hair, the laugh, exact same. I stared at him. And you watched. I watched. Went back the next week. And the week after, Arthur, your sister is living in a house in Pickering with a man named Craig Brewer. He manages a Canadian Tire in Scarborough. They've been together at least 3 years, maybe longer. And Thomas knows. Gerry nodded. Thomas knows. He's known from the beginning. The money you give him, he keeps half and gives the rest to Margaret and Craig. I followed him once to a storage unit on Brock Road in Whitby. He met Margaret there. They moved boxes into a van. I wrote down the license plate. It's registered to Craig Brewer. I put my glass down because my hand was shaking too hard to hold it. Where's Sophie? Gerry paused. That's the part that made me come to you, Arthur. Sophie's been living with Thomas's mother in Sudbury for 2.5 years. Thomas told everyone she needed to be closer to her grandmother after Margaret's death. Said it was better for her adjustment. But the truth is, Margaret didn't want to keep up the act around a child. Too risky. A 6-year-old might say something to the wrong person. So, they sent her away. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart. Something deeper. The foundation of every belief I'd ever held about my sister, about family, about the basic decency of people you love. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed listening to the furnace click on and off, staring at the ceiling, running through 30 years of memories and wondering which ones were real. By 5 in the morning, I'd made a decision. I called a private investigator named Dan Morales, former RCMP officer, now working independently out of an office on Simcoe Street in Oshawa. A friend from the plant had used him during a custody dispute and said he was thorough, discreet, and didn't flinch. I drove to his office that morning and laid everything out. Gerry's observations, my 3 years of payments, all of it. Find out everything, I told him. I want to know where she's living, what name she's using, how they pulled it off. I want documentation, photographs, financial records, everything you can get legally. I handed him $2,000, the same amount I would have given Thomas that month. Dan was meticulous. Over the next 4 weeks, he assembled a file that was nearly an inch thick. Margaret was living under the name Marie Baudouin. She'd obtained a fraudulent Ontario driver's license, a new social insurance number, even a library card under the fake name. She worked part-time at a garden center in Pickering, cash under the table, while Craig's salary covered the rent. The drowning had been staged. Margaret had planned it for months. She'd taken the canoe out on Lake Simcoe during a day when Environment Canada had issued a small craft advisory. She'd worn the life jacket loosely, deliberately let it slip off, then swum to a spot on the eastern shore where Craig was waiting with a car. The empty canoe and floating life jacket did the rest. The OPP searched for her body for 9 days. Divers went down 4 times. They never found anything because there was nothing to find. Why did she do it? Dan's investigation uncovered the answer in layers, like peeling paint off an old wall. Margaret owed nearly $70,000. 2 maxed credit cards, a line of credit she'd taken against the townhouse without Thomas knowing, and a personal loan from a private lender in Toronto who charged interest rates that would make your eyes water. She'd developed a shopping addiction after a bout of depression 3 years before her supposed death. Online orders, designer clothes, furniture she stored in a rented unit because there was no room in the townhouse. Thomas found out about the debt 8 months before the drowning. Instead of confronting it, instead of calling me, instead of walking into a credit counseling office or declaring bankruptcy like a normal person, they decided Margaret should die. The plan was straightforward. Fake the drowning. Let Thomas collect her life insurance, which was $45,000 through her workplace policy. Let me send money every month out of guilt and love. Let Craig work, save everything, and in 5 years, they'd have enough to leave the country. Start over somewhere warm. Dan found printouts of real estate listings in Costa Rica in Craig's desk drawer, along with brochures for immigration lawyers who specialized in Central American residency permits. Thomas had been in on it from the first day. He and Margaret had grown distant years before, but they'd made an arrangement. He'd play the grieving widower, collect my money, and get his cut when they left. Margaret had been seeing Craig for 2 years before the drowning. He was her exit strategy, her new life. The worst part, Dan had managed to record a conversation through a window that Craig had left open on a warm evening. Margaret, Thomas, and Craig were sitting on the back patio in Pickering, drinking wine. Dan's recording device picked up their voices clearly. Margaret said, "Arthur dropped off the money last Saturday. 2,000. Same as always. He looked exhausted. I think his hip is getting worse." Craig laughed. "The man's 64 and hauling flooring. How long can he keep that up?" "Long enough," Margaret said. And then softer, almost to herself, "He was always the responsible one." Thomas added, "Responsible and predictable. That's what makes this work." I listened to that recording in Dan's office. He offered to stop it. I told him to play it again. I needed to hear it twice to make sure the words matched the voices, to make sure the woman laughing about my destroyed hip was really my sister, the girl who once nicked her thumb carving initials into our maple tree. Dan gave me one final piece of intelligence. In 3 weeks, on November 20th, Margaret, Craig, and Thomas were booked on a flight from Toronto Pearson to San Jose, Costa Rica. One-way tickets purchased under their fake names. They had approximately $85,000 saved across 3 accounts. Once they boarded that plane, I'd never see any of them again. I drove to the Durham Regional Police Station the next morning. Detective Laura Parks listened to my account, reviewed Dan's file, and called in 2 colleagues. They spent 3 hours going through the evidence. "This is solid," Detective Parks said. "Insurance fraud, identity fraud, conspiracy. And if the OPP spent public resources searching for someone who wasn't dead, that opens up additional charges. We can coordinate with the RCMP on the false identity documents." "What about Sophie?" I asked. Parks looked at me carefully. "If Thomas's mother is caring for her in Sudbury, we'll work with Children's Aid. The child's welfare is the priority. You're her uncle. Once this is resolved, you'd be in a strong position to petition for custody. Would I want that? Sophie was 8 years old. She believed her mother drowned in a lake. She'd been shipped off to Sudbury and left there like a piece of furniture that didn't fit the new floor plan. Yes, I wanted that more than I'd wanted anything since my wife was alive. On November 19th, the day before their flight, I drove to Thomas's townhouse in Ajax one last time. I had $2,000 in an envelope. I knocked on the door. Thomas opened it. He was wearing a Leafs hoodie and holding a coffee mug. He smiled when he saw me. The same tired, grateful smile he'd been performing for 3 years. "Arthur, you're a few days early this month. I know. Wanted to make sure you got it before the weekend. How's Sophie doing up in Sudbury?" Something shifted behind his eyes. "Oh, she's great. Mom says she's loving the snow. Built a fort last week." Lies. Dan had confirmed that Thomas hadn't called his mother in over a month. Sophie had been asking to come home for Christmas. Nobody had answered her. "That's wonderful," I said. "Listen, I was thinking of driving up to Sudbury to see her. Maybe take her to Science North. She'd like that, right?" Thomas hesitated. The smile didn't reach his eyes. It never had. "You know, Mom's got a pretty packed schedule right now. The holidays and all. Maybe after New Year?" "Sure. After New Year." I handed him the envelope. He took it. I walked back to my car without looking back. The next morning, November 20th, I stood in the departures hall at Toronto Pearson Airport with Detective Parks, 2 Durham regional officers, an RCMP constable, and 2 Peel regional officers who had jurisdiction at the airport. We positioned ourselves near the Air Canada check-in counters, spread out, blending with the morning rush of travelers. At 8:52 a.m., I saw them. Thomas came through the sliding doors first, pulling a large suitcase, looking around with the nervous energy of a man who couldn't quite believe he was about to get away with it. Craig followed, carrying a backpack and a duffel bag, and behind them, wearing sunglasses indoors and a scarf wrapped high around her chin, was Margaret, my sister, alive, walking through an airport with a fake passport and $85,000 in stolen money, leaving behind a daughter who thought she was dead. Detective Parks spoke quietly into her radio. "I have visual on all 3 subjects. Moving to intercept." They approached from 3 directions. Thomas saw the uniforms first. His face went white. He dropped the suitcase handle and took half a step backward, bumping into Craig. Margaret froze. She pulled her sunglasses off. And for 1 second, her eyes found mine across the terminal. I saw recognition, then shock, then something I hadn't expected. Shame. Craig tried to walk away calmly, as if he'd just remembered he was in the wrong terminal. An officer caught his arm before he'd gone 4 steps. Thomas didn't resist. He stood perfectly still, like a man who'd been expecting this moment for 3 years and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. Margaret dropped her carry-on bag and started crying. Detective Parks identified herself and read them their rights. Other officers searched the luggage. Inside Thomas's suitcase, wrapped in clothing, they found $62,000 in cash. Craig's duffel held another $23,000 and 3 fraudulent passports. Margaret's carry-on contained printouts of a rental property in Guanacaste, Costa Rica, along with a burner phone with messages coordinating their departure. As they placed Margaret in handcuffs, she looked at me again. "Arthur, please, let me explain." I shook my head. "You had 3 years to explain, Margaret. You had 3 years to pick up the phone. You let me believe you were dead. You let me work myself to the bone, sending money to your husband so he could fund your new life. You left your daughter in Sudbury like she was an inconvenience." She opened her mouth, closed it. The officer guided her toward the exit. Thomas was the last one out. He stopped in front of me. The officer paused, allowing it. "She's your sister," Thomas said, as if that explained something. "She was," I said. They took them away in separate cruisers. I stood in the departures hall for a long time after that, watching families hug at the check-in counters, couples holding hands, children pressing their faces against the windows to watch the planes, normal people going to normal places, People who hadn't built their futures on the betrayal of someone who loved them. The investigation and legal proceedings took almost 8 months. The Crown Prosecutor's Office compiled a formidable case. Margaret was charged with insurance fraud, identity fraud, conspiracy, and public mischief for the resources wasted on the search. Thomas faced the same charges, plus fraudulent misrepresentation of a dependent's welfare. Craig was charged with conspiracy, aiding an offender, and possession of forged documents. The defense argued Margaret had been driven to desperate measures by crushing debt and untreated mental health issues. They asked for compassion. The judge acknowledged the debt and the depression, but noted that Margaret had 3 years to come forward. 3 years during which she chose to continue the deception, abandon her child, and exploit her brother's generosity. Margaret received 6 years. Thomas got 5. Craig got 3.5. The court ordered restitution of $72,000 to me, which represented the total amount I'd sent over 3 years. Whether I'd ever see that money was another question, but the acknowledgement mattered. 2 weeks after sentencing, I drove to Sudbury. 5 hours on the 400 and the 69, past Barrie and Parry Sound, through the rock cuts and pine forests of northern Ontario. Thomas's mother, Diane, lived in a bungalow in the south end of the city, near Bell Park. She was 70 years old, thin, quiet. She opened the door and looked at me with eyes that had already cried themselves dry. "She knows about Thomas," Diane said. "I told her he made a mistake and has to go away for a while. She doesn't know about Margaret. I didn't know how. Can I see her?" Diane led me through the house to the back door. Sophie was in the yard, sitting cross-legged on a patch of grass that was just starting to go brown with the autumn cold. She had a sketchbook open on her lap and was drawing with colored pencils. When she heard the door, she looked up. She had Margaret's eyes, our father's eyes, dark brown, deep-set, watchful. "Sophie," Diane said gently, "this is your Uncle Arthur, your mom's brother. Do you remember him?" Sophie studied me for a moment. She was 8 but looked younger, small for her age, serious-faced. Then she said, "You came to our house at Christmas once. You brought me a book about constellations. I'd forgotten that. But yes, I had. 3.5 years ago, the last Christmas before the drowning." "That's right," I said. I sat down on the step near her but not too close. I didn't want to crowd her. "Can I see what you're drawing?" She turned the sketchbook toward me. It was a picture of a house. Not a child's simple box with a triangle roof drawing, but something more detailed. A porch with railing. A big window. A garden with flowers along a path. A tree in the front yard with branches wide enough to sit in. "That's beautiful," I said. "Is that a place you know?" She shook her head. "It's a place I want to live. Somewhere with a garden and a tree and a room that's just mine." I looked at Diane. She looked at me. Something passed between us that didn't need words. The custody process took 5 months. Diane loved Sophie, but she was 70 with arthritis in both hands and a heart condition that required medication and monitoring. She couldn't keep up with an 8-year-old. Margaret was in prison. Thomas was in prison. I was Sophie's closest capable relative. I hired a family lawyer in Oshawa, filed the paperwork with the Ontario Superior Court, had a home study done by Children's Aid, passed every check, every interview, every assessment. On a cold morning in April, with the last of the snow still clinging to the curbs, I drove back to Sudbury and brought Sophie home. Home to Oshawa. Home to the brick house where Margaret and I grew up. Home to the backyard with the maple tree that still had our initials carved into it, AR+MB, swollen and faded but still there. I enrolled Sophie in the elementary school 3 blocks away. I learned to make lunches that weren't just ham sandwiches and apple slices. I figured out how to braid hair by watching videos on my phone until my fingers stopped fumbling. I planted a garden in the backyard that spring, the first time flowers had grown there since my wife had been alive, and Sophie helped me with every step. She'd kneel in the dirt with her hands black up to the wrists, laughing when I accidentally sprayed her with the hose while watering the tomato plants. Gerry came by often. He'd sit on my back porch with a cup of tea while Sophie drew at the kitchen table, visible through the screen door. "You did the right thing," Gerry said one evening, watching Sophie color. "I don't know if there was a right thing," I said. I just know I couldn't let them keep doing it. Not to me. Not to her. Gerry sipped his tea. That girl's got a chance now. That's more than they were giving her. I thought about Margaret sometimes. I wondered if she lay in her cell at Grand Valley and thought about Sophie. Wondered if she remembered the maple tree, the initials, the popsicle I gave her when she cut her thumb. Wondered if she felt the weight of what she'd thrown away. Not just our relationship, but the chance to watch her daughter grow up, to see her learn to skate, to hear her laugh at a bad joke. I wondered. But I didn't visit. Some doors, once closed, need to stay closed. Sophie turned 9 in August. We had a party in the backyard. Gerry came. A few of her school friends. Diane made the drive down from Sudbury. I grilled burgers on a barbecue I'd bought secondhand from a neighbor. And Sophie blew out her candles under the maple tree while the August sun filtered through the leaves. That night, after everyone had left and Sophie had brushed her teeth and changed into her pajamas, she came to find me in the kitchen. I was washing the last of the dishes. She hugged me from behind, her arms barely reaching around my waist. Thank you for my party, Uncle Arthur. You're welcome, sweetheart. She didn't let go. Can I ask you something? Anything. Are you going to send me away? I turned off the tap, dried my hands, knelt down so we were face to face, even though my hip protested and my knees creaked like old floorboards. I looked her in the eyes, my father's eyes, Margaret's eyes. No, Sophie, I'm not sending you anywhere. This is your home. You're staying right here. She nodded. Her chin trembled once, then steadied. Okay, because I like it here. I like the garden, and the tree, and I like you. I like you too, kid. She went to bed. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard the creak of her bedroom door, heard the soft thump of her jumping into bed. Then, silence. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret and I used to sit as children, eating our mother's butter tarts and arguing about whose turn it was to take out the recycling. The same table where I'd sat with Gerry 8 months ago, learning that everything I believed about my sister was a lie. I thought about what I'd lost and what I'd found. I'd lost Margaret. Not to a lake, which would have been cruel but clean. I'd lost her to greed, to cowardice, to the kind of betrayal that doesn't just break trust but rewrites every memory you ever shared with someone. Every laugh, every holiday, every phone call at midnight, all of it contaminated now, all of it suspect. But I'd found Sophie. A second chance. Not to replace my sister, because nothing could do that, but to be the person Sophie deserved in her life. Someone who showed up. Someone who stayed. I still drive the delivery truck 3 days a week. My hip still aches. My back still locks up on cold mornings. But every dollar I earn now goes towards Sophie's future. Her education, her skating lessons, the new winter coat she'll need when the snow comes, the RESP account I opened at the credit union the week she moved in. And that makes every heavy roll of flooring, every flight of stairs, every morning I have to stand in the shower waiting for my body to cooperate. Worth it. The people who betrayed me are in federal institutions. Justice was served. The restitution order sits in a file on my lawyer's desk, and maybe someday I'll see some of that money come back. Maybe I won't. It doesn't matter as much as I thought it would, because the real victory isn't their punishment. It's Sophie, asleep upstairs in a room we painted pale green together, surrounded by her drawings of gardens and trees and houses with big front porches. It's the sound of her laughter drifting down the stairs in the morning. It's the initials on the maple tree, AR plus MB, and the new ones Sophie carved underneath them last weekend with my Swiss Army knife, the same one Margaret used 40 years ago. SB, she carved. Sophie Beaulieu. Then she looked up at me and smiled. Now I'm part of the tree too. I did it for my sister once. Every dollar, every aching joint, every sleepless night. I did it out of love, and it was stolen from me. I'm doing it for her daughter now. And this time, it's real.